is an old story from China. It's called The Runaway Horse. Once, at the edge of a small village, there lived an old man and his son. Of all the people in the village, these two were the most poor, and the only possession the young man could call his own was his horse. She was a strong young mare, and every morning he'd leap up upon her back and gallop out across the misty fields, hear the thunder of her hoofs, feel the wind blowing in his face. And it was the only freedom he ever really knew. But never, ever would he ride his mare into the forest itself, for riding beyond the forest, which was not deep, upon the steppes were the nomads. Fierce warrior people who long ago had attacked the farmers of the village. But no one could really remember it. It was more like a story born on the old men's lips. Well, one day the young man was seated in front of his house, and there nearby was his mare, placidly tethered to a post by a leather strap, when suddenly she seemed to sense something in the air. Her nostrils flared, and she snapped the leather strap and began to run off. He jumped up, the young man did, and he waved his arms. "Come back! Come back, please!" But she seemed not to hear him. She galloped into the forest across the fields and was gone. And when the neighbors in the village saw that the one possession the young man could call his own had just run off, they all came crowding into the hut, and they said, "Oh, what great misfortune! Look, you lost your horse. Now you are twice as poor." Twice as... And they all pushed one another out the door. But his old father looked at his son and narrowed his eyes and asked, "How do you know this is not a blessing? How do you know?" Well, the young man thought to himself, "Losing my only horse? A blessing? How can that be?" And yet, it wasn't but a week later. He was lying in his bed when he heard the sound of horses' hoofs. He pushed himself up on his elbow. He looked out his window, and there, galloping home, came his mare, and following her, a great stallion trotted. It was a war horse. Why, she had gone through the herds of the nomads on the far side of the forest and had cut loose a mate. And when the neighbors saw that there were now two horses instead of one, placidly tethered to the post, they came crowding into his house and said, "Oh, what great good fortune! Look! Two horses! Twice as many as one! This keeps up, you'll be a horse dealer!" Horse dealer! And they all happily pushed one another out the door. But his old father narrowed his eyes and looked at his son and asked, "How do you know this is not disaster? How do you know?" The young man thought to himself, "Losing my horse, but then gaining a mating pair. Disaster. How can that be?" And yet, it wasn't but a week later. He was riding his horse, but not his mare, who knew him. For the first time, he'd been foolish enough to climb up onto the back of the war horse. And the giant beast did not know what to do with such a light load. They did not know how to ride. And so the giant horse began to thunder his way toward the forest. Across the fields, suddenly into the forest, the horse galloped. Limbs were flying past the young man's head. All he could do was wrap his fingers into the horse's mane and hold on for his life. And then suddenly the horse reared up and twisted and threw the young man to the ground. And in the fall, he broke his hip. And in great pain he lay, weeping for many hours, until the villagers, afraid of even being in the forbidden forest, found him and carried him home. And as they put him in his bed, they looked at him and said, "Oh, what great misfortune. Look, you broke your hip. You will never be the same. Goodbye." And they all left. But his old father, seeing the pain not only in his son's body, but in his eyes, looked and asked, "How do you know this is not a blessing? How do you know?" Well, the young man's hip indeed was broken, and it would not knit well. A week became a month, and he lay helpless in his bed. And he wondered, as he heard the children playing outside in the village streets, whether he would ever walk again. Until one morning, the gongs in the corners of the village rang wildly. That was a sign of great danger. The young man pushed himself up on his elbow, and he looked out the window. And there, running past it, were villagers, some with pitchforks, some with shovels, some with staves. They had no weapons. It seemed that the nomads were galloping across the meadows. Into the village they charged, and a great battle was fought. And in it, 9 out of 10 villagers who fought to defend their lives ended up losing their lives. But the young man, who could not rise to fight through no fault of his own, survived to live a long life, albeit with a limp. And so the old ones in China say that just beneath blessing crouches disaster. But always perched above disaster, one finds blessing. And it is impossible to know which is really which.